Hi, everyone. My name is Sage Gerson. I am a PhD candidate at the University of California, Santa Barbara. I grew up in rural Oregon, which is its own weird place. And I'm really excited to be here on this panel. I have known Jess for a few years remotely now, and I'm so thankful for our collaborations. And I'm excited to kind of be present, though I wish we were in person.
Eileen, you want to go ahead now?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to apologize in advance for I have kind of shaky internet. So just letting y'all know that could be a potential disruption. Yeah, so my name is Eileen Elizabeth Wagoner, and I'm originally from Back Creek Valley, West Virginia. I am a second-year candidate in creative nonfiction here at the University of California in Riverside. And I primarily write about queerness and landscape and grieving rituals. So that's sort of my work here.
Awesome. We look forward to interacting with the audience and again in the Q&A session. And we'll go ahead and turn this over. Again, Emily, you want to start us off?
Yeah, so I'm going to share my screen. I put in the Google Drive a link to, or I put in the chat a link to a Google Drive that has this handout and also my talk in it. So if like, I don't know, your dog is barking at something and you have to go get them, which is my primary mode of like Zoom nonsense, you can jump right back in and you shouldn't miss too much. So I'm going to go ahead and set a timer here so I stay on track. So I decided to do research and do this talk on what I'm calling queer kitchen tables, the intersections of queerness, food, and women in contemporary Appalachian literature. And so my primary argument here is that contemporary queer Appalachian women writers utilize food to signify both their bodies and Appalachia as place identities. And such signification has to be contextualized through an intersectional lens of gender and sexuality and the American perception of Appalachia as an othered space. And that writers grapple for what geographers and sort of social geographers call place belongingness within the body and Appalachia as spaces and places, using food as sort of a signifier of this place identity. And for this presentation, I focused on two poems from the LGBTQ Appalachians anthology that came out in 2019. One is Domestic Life by Dorothy Allison, and the other is a poem titled Pork Belly by Savannah Sipple. And I've pulled a couple of quotes here for y'all to see from those poems. Before I get into talking about those poems, there is what feels like a long and winding theoretical framework here, but it makes sense to me, so maybe it will make sense. So the first is sort of acknowledging the pitfalls and limitations for doing this kind of work. So Adrienne Rich has a very excellent essay about how an attempt to universalize women's bodies is a very white Western feminist framework. So saying that all women have the same sort of body and experience that body similarly in space is like very bioessentialist and very problematic and definitely not what I'm trying to do here. So that's one thing. And the next is that John D. Holtzman, who's doing sort of folklore and food studies, talks about how the emphasis of women in the kitchen essentially can showcase sort of patriarchal and sexist points of view and the ways that it's sort of a stereotypical role in which we would put women. And so in saying this, I'm not trying to undercut my own work, but to say that I think that Dorothy Allison and Savannah Sipple are doing very different things than universalizing women's bodies or putting women into a stereotypical domestic sphere. And I think that they're playing with these ideas in ways that are really interesting. So moving on to talking about place belongingness in queer Appalachian lit, there were a few sort of geographic points of view, like the study of space that I thought were interesting here. So one, Astrida Nemanis talks about women's bodies being transhumanist. So women's bodies being connected to and of land and sort of the beyond the self. Karen Barad moves this forward even more, saying, and this feels, especially in Appalachian literature, like something that feels very obvious, but I had not really seen it written down, that human beings are of the world, and the world influences how we see ourselves in any given space. And so thinking about writers and people in Appalachia and Appalachians sort of not of observers of the world, but this intra-activity of the world and the self and women and poetry all coming together to inform one another. And I bumped into this term, place belongingness, which is an identity that responds to, interacts with, or is seen within a geography or a space. And I thought that this was really interesting if we're thinking about talking about queer Appalachians and sort of that as a phrase, because I feel that so much of discourse around queer Appalachian identity is the double otherness. So if you're queer, well, then you're other. And if you're Appalachian, then you're other. And if you're queer in Appalachia, you must be like an othery other, right? And I don't think that that is as solid of a framework for queer Appalachian identity as I think I have seen other folks think it is, if that makes sense. I think that being queer Appalachian is a place belonging and a belongingness of space. So here I'm taking this environmental psychology concept of place identity and place belongingness and applying it to the written queer body in Appalachian literature. And food is a signifier for this. So food is sort of a door by which these authors are walking into that place belongingness. And all of these identities are very interwoven in one another. So if we're thinking of people not being isolated within themselves or within or from their bodies, then to me it becomes this very braided and woven sort of identity set of queer women writing Appalachia with food. And so then I went down the rabbit hole of food studies, which if you want to spend several weeks thinking about something cool, I suggest that you do. But I found a couple of texts that were sort of helping me think through it. I came into the idea for this presentation simply by reading this anthology and being like, there's a lot of food here. And so I kind of backed into food studies a little bit. Michael Owen Jones has this great primer on food studies for the uninitiated like me, and is talking about how food is always used as symbolism and signifier and metaphor in, you know, all kinds of art. And so if we're thinking about food and Appalachian food as not only a marker of space, but as a symbol of queer womanhood or a symbol of pushing up against patriarchal conceptions of what women are and what Appalachia is, and like an anti-rurality or something like that, I think it gets really interesting. And so with all of that all set up, I am talking about these two poems. The first is Dorothy Allison's Domestic Life. Like I said, it's out of this anthology, LGBTQ Fiction and Poetry from Appalachia. And it's a brief poem. In the poem, the speaker is chopping vegetables, cutting everything down to manageable size, before then describing, quote, the memory of his hand going back, the image of her body falling forward, a cup in her hand, vegetables rolling off the table. And so in this poem, the speaker is discussing interpersonal domestic violence between a man and a woman in the same sphere as creating a meal and dealing with food, and mirroring a woman's body in the same language as is being used with discussing preparing these vegetables. So the speaker ascribing the meaning to the falling body and to the food and the the memory associated between these two food-based actions show this embodied understanding of the body in a domestic space. And contextualizing this with Allison's known identity as a queer Appalachian woman in an anthology of queer Appalachian literature is, I think, very important as well. And so I think if I were to hand someone on the street this poem and be like, what's this about? They would be like, a man and a woman in food. But because we're contextualizing it within this anthology, within who Dorothy Allison is in Appalachian literature, it takes on this new level of discussing sort of patriarchal and cisnormative roles and women's space in that sphere. And then Savannah Sippel's Pork Belly, which is just an incredible poem. In Pork Belly, Sippel is using food to confront perceptions of bodies, as well as place work geographically using traditionally coded Appalachian food and the relative status of these foods. So she's doing a lot of work in a pretty brief poem. So one excerpt here, imagine you clutch the carving knife, slice it under and against your own ribs, one cut for every time they call you fat. So having the body manipulated as food and being writ literally as food here. And then reinscribing meaning to the body as nourishment. So the last line of the poem reads as something like, tell me how many mouths are you trying to feed? And there's this intense pushback against fat phobia and classism and conceptions of women's bodies in Appalachia that Sippel's doing in this work. And she's creating place belongingness by utilizing this transhumanist and beyond human framework to make the body into something else entirely in this poem, which is a nourishment and a reclamation of the body in space. And I just love that poem. I think I would have done any presentation to talk about it. So excited it's this one. So some key takeaways here. I think that queer women and probably women in general in Appalachia are using food to symbolize place identity, both within bodies and as bodies within Appalachia. So it's this nested sort of identity marker. And they're utilizing recognizably Appalachian food to begin this imagistic and associative understanding. So whenever we hear pork belly or fat factor, you know, these sorts of traditionally rural or Appalachian foods, that adds another layer of meaning for me. One thing that I thought was important to note is that while place identity and place belongingness, kind of like the word community, I think we want it to be like a warm sort of fuzzy feeling. It's definitely not that in these poems. And instead, I think we need to sit with this understanding that a place belongingness can have this complexity of discussing gender and sizeism and fat phobia and gendered violence and sexuality and cis heteronormativity and all of these other things that show up in Appalachia because they show up in the US, and that these authors are pushing back against these violences in their work by asserting a place belonging. So I definitely don't want it to, I don't want you to think that I'm saying like, and then they were all happy and it was good and warm and fuzzy, because I really don't think that that's what these works are doing at all. I think that these authors are decoupling gendered food expectations from heterosexuality and heteronormativity, and that the metaphorical kitchen becomes a space for the recreation of meaning. And, you know, thinking about Appalachian food in literature as more than a place indicator, and more as a symbol of place identity, place belongingness, and a way not only to show that you're in Appalachia in a poem, but discussing the body and the self and relationships and things like that. So I have all of my little citations down here, but that's all I have.
Thank you so much, Emily. In fact, I love Savannah's poem as well. I just sent her book to my niece for her birthday earlier this month in Appalachia. And I'm waiting to see what she thinks of it. All right, Sage, you ready?
Yes. I'm going to share my screen really quick just to share my slides. Okay. Can everyone see my screen? Yes? Okay. This presentation focuses on the entanglements of identity, place, and desire through the examination of intersectional queer Appalachian cultural production, specifically the poetry of Appalachian poet and National Book Award winner Nikki Finney and the zine produced by Appalachian Political Queer Arts Group, the Electric Dirt Collective. In Finney and the Electric Dirt Collective's art and poetry, I see queerness operating through the depictions of queer sex acts and sexual and gender expression and identity represented on the page, and also as an orientation to the region and a perspective through which a critique of normative understandings and representations of what it means to be Appalachian are articulated, theorized, and embodied. Intersectional queer rural aesthetics disrupt representations of the Appalachian region as one of isolation and lack, and instead refashion it as a site of transformation and disruption. Drawing on queer of color critique, especially Jose Esteban Munoz's writing and thinking about methodologies of hope, I argue that intersectional queer rural stylistics undermine conceptions of the rural as a place of white conservative heteronormativity while gesturing beyond the present towards queer Appalachian futurity. Thinking about queer Appalachian cultural production requires dwelling in the intersections of sexuality, gender, race, regional belonging or place belongingness, which I really loved, and class. To begin, I want to foreground the Black feminist poets and scholars that shape and inform my thinking about Finney's poetry in particular here, especially my use of the term intersectionality, first coined by Kimberly Crenshaw about 3 decades ago. And I return to Crenshaw here in order to credit the Black feminist theorizing, shaping, and catalyzing so much knowledge production about identity, specifically in regards to race, gender, and sexuality. While coined by Crenshaw, attention to what we now think of as intersecting identities is reflected and referenced in other works of Black feminist thinking, including works by Patricia Hill Collins, Bell Hooks, and Audre Lorde, among others. Crenshaw writes in Mapping the Margins, Intersectionality, Identity Politics, and Violence Against Women of Color that her focus on the intersections of race and gender, quote, highlights the need to account for multiple grounds of identity when considering how the social world is constructed, end quote, and that intersectionality is a, quote, process of recognizing as social and systemic what was formerly perceived as isolated and individual. Nikki Finney's poetry is constructed out of the intersections of multiple grounds of identity, enunciating the experiences of being a Black queer woman in Appalachia. As a poet, Finney has spoken at length about her formative roots growing up during the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Power Movement, and the Black Arts Movement, asserting in a recent interview with Scalawag magazine, which commemorated the publication of her most recent book, published in 2020, Love Child's Hotbed of Occasional Poetry, that she has always desired for her poetry to be useful to others as something she created with her own 2 hands. Finney, as her biography states, aims her words to do more than pearl and decorate the page. I think Finney's conceptualization of her work gestures to an understanding of poetry that works against a representation and materiality binary, instead highlighting the entangled and co-constitutive relationship between regional artistic production and activism. So often students and literary scholars, and I know this was the case for me, are taught to close read a text, to consider the text world as somehow separate from the material or embodied world from which it was produced. Finney's poetic self-theorizing shows how this is false, I think, and the ways in which material and embodied context shape cultural production. In her aim for her words to do more than decorate the page, I also think Finney's references the power of poetry and the way it works in the world, embodied politically and materially. In her interview in Scalawag magazine, Finney states that, quote, the inarticulators would have us believe that poetry should be kept out of our daily conversations and saved for the mountaintops or the champagne parties. But poetry belongs where truth exists. Poetry wants to live where honesty and courage have been prioritized. Poetry is the first language of a free and flying, unchained heart. Here, Finney echoes Audre Lorde's assertion that poetry is not a luxury. In the same way that Lorde asserted her need for poetry because it enabled her to dream about life, and to consider poetry a luxury is to give up on the future of her world, Finney's self-theorizing also deeply intertwines poetry, freedom, and aliveness. Finney's 2011 National Book Award acceptance speech contextualizes the relationship between freedom and poetics, mapping the empowerment she finds in reading and writing within the longer history of the U.S.'s system of chattel slavery and its forced illiteracy. In Finney's poem, The Oriole, from her 2011 National Book Award winning volume, Head Off and Split, her readers encounter a speaker teetering on the edge of transformation. The poem opens, I stop my hand midair. If I touch her there, everything about me will be true. The new world, discovered without a pick or axe. The poem, while marveling at the new world, is also unequivocal about the threat of violence that shadows its speaker's transformation. Finney goes on, I will be what Brenda Jones was stoned for in 1969. I saw it as a girl, but didn't know I was taking in myself. My hand remembers treading the watery room, just behind the rose-veiled eyes of memory, alone in the yard tucked beneath the hood of her car, lucky clover all about her feet, green tea-sweet necklace for her mud pie crusty work boots. She fends off their spit in words with silent two-handed twists and turns of her socket wrench. A hurl of sticks and stones, and only me to whisper for her from sidewalk far, break my bones. Rural places are typically understood to be dangerous and isolating for LGBTQIA+ folks, as is demonstrated by Finney's poetic speaker's recounted memory. The division between urban and rural has had a major impact on the ways in which small towns are considered hostile to queer folks, and urban areas are cast as the natural environment for queer communities to flourish. As Jack Halberstam points out, in a Queer Time and Place, Transgender Bodies, Subcultural Lives, and this is a quote, affluent gay populations are often described as part of a creative class that enhances the city cultural life and cultural capital. And this class of gays are then cast in opposition to the small town family life and values of Midwestern Americans. While there is plenty of truth to this, the division also occludes the lives of non-urban queers. Rural America is cast as dangerous and unwelcoming to queer folks, and equally damaging, urbanism is an assumed prerequisite for culture and creativity. This assumption dismisses rural queer arts and crafts and making culture, which in turn emphasizes the importance of Finney's poetics and efforts like that of the Electric Dirt Collective, who focus on funding and supporting art projects and homespun cultural traditions. Finney concludes The Oriole by continuing to intertwine her desire and pleasure and the looming threat of violence. She closes, years of long talking have brought us to the land of the body. Our skin is one endless prayer bead of brown. If my hand ever lands, I will fly past dreaming Australian Aborigines. The old claw hammer and monkey wrench that flew at Brenda Jones will fly across the yard of ocean at me. A grease rag will be thrust into my painter's pants against my will. I will never be able to wash or peel any of this away. Before the night is over, someone I do not know will want the keys to my '55 Silver Thunderbird. He will chase me down the street. A gaggle of spooked hens will fly up in my grandmother's yard, never to lay another egg, just as I am jumped, kneed, pulled, finally, to the high ground of sweet clover. Finney's poem highlights the endless prayer of the land of the body, the powerful transporting flight the pleasure of touch catalyzes. It also outlines the thrown claw hammer and monkey wrench, the thrust grease rag against the speaker's will, the speaker's inability to wash or peel this experience away. Despite this, the poem ends in what I perceive to be a type of sanctuary, a return to the high ground of sweet clover. In the same way that the lucky clover are all about Brenda Jones' feet at the beginning of the poem, the green tea sweet necklace surrounds the speaker at its close, offering the speaker the safety of high ground and the luck of sweet clover, a landing place, a soft olfactory bed for their transformation. Compounding the rural's reputation as hostile to queer community formation, folks who determinedly insist on being both queer and rural are often overlooked in queer theory, though this is changing a little bit, which too often asserts the urban as an integral aspect of queer identity, culture, and community formation. Scott Herring writes in Another Country, Queer Anti-Urbanism, that, and this is a quote, the rural becomes a slur. Suffice it to say that if recent strains of queer theory and recent forms of LGBTQ politics share common ground, it's usually a dismissal of rurality as such. A dismissal not only commonplace, but let's put the farm on it, chronic. Too often, queer theory frames the city as the naturalized epicenter of contemporary queer life. Scott Herring calls this metronormativity, and he identifies that metronormativity acts to police what counts for and as queer taste and queer group identity. Herring identifies 6 different and interconnected axes of metronormativity: narratological, racial, socioeconomic, temporal, epistemological, and aesthetic. These 6 axes help support, sustain, and standardize the idealizing geographies of lesbian and gay urbanism, an urbanism that facilitates, according to Herring, the ongoing commodification, corporatization, and depoliticization of US-based queer cultures. Linking queer metronormativity with depoliticization, regimes of global capital, sorry, that was a hard word for me to say, and aesthetic assimilation, Herring presents queer rurality, or anti-urbanism as he calls it, as a potential form of aesthetic, socioeconomic, and temporal disruption. Rural stylistics of a queer anti-urbanism, he writes, can become infinitely disruptive. These stylistics may thus have the evocative power of an utterance which puts things in a new light. In part, I take my understanding of queer rurality's aesthetics, politics, and potential to reframe, transform, and disrupt from Herring's theorizing. The Electric Dirt Collective is simultaneously an artist collective, social justice activist network, mutual aid network, curated submission-based Instagram and publisher of the Electric Dirt zine, and most recently, nonprofit organization. Importantly, in its history of Appalachian and Southern queer self-representation and mutual aid, it works to create and support communities of care. Through the collective social, political, material, and artistic commitments, it embodies the ways that rural queer representation can help facilitate queer rural community building and showcases the importance of rural queer cultural production. The Electric Dirt Collective was founded from the coalfields of West Virginia by Gina Mamone, who was guided by the vision of Femspiration's Bryn Kelly and Amanda Arkansassi Harris. Mamone is the creative director of the Queer Appalachia Project, former president of Riot Grrrl Inc., the world's largest queer record label, and creative director of the first volume of Electric Dirt, published in 2017, and whose cover you can see on this slide. The first volume of the zine featured submissions from more than 30 rural, queer, and allied artists and writers. The Electric Dirt Collective's curated submission-based Instagram at Queer Appalachia website and zine provide platforms where, according to their website, the underrepresented and misrepresented get to represent themselves. As their website explains, the Electric Dirt Collective is comprised of folks from different racial, socioeconomic, educational, and religious backgrounds. For far too long, depictions of these regions have been whitewashed and have made invisible communities of color. We acknowledge the necessity for our work to not emulate these patterns and seek that both the project and its contributors accurately and appropriately reflect our diverse community. The Electric Dirt Collective's commitment to diversity goes beyond an empty neoliberal multiculturalism, as is demonstrated in their current transition to Black and Indigenous leadership. The Electric Dirt Collective offers glimpses at self-represented rural queer lives and is an online resource for network that has material, social, political, and artistic impact. In other words, the Electric Dirt Collective facilitates community building while also providing a window into rural queer self-representation. They offer microgrants to projects that celebrate our culture, community, and unique identities. They offer recipes, homespun craft tips, and promote events both political and artistic. They have and are funding and hosting a queer addicts recovery and support group, as well as supporting through raising awareness and soliciting donations, land reparations for Black and Indigenous farmers, helping organize tree sits in opposition to a pipeline that would have bored under the Appalachian Trail, and calling for art and action that subverts the lingering prevalence of Confederate white supremacy in the South. This in particular, their call for art and action around queers in the Civil War, shows how queering the rural disrupts and undermines rural conservative politics, while simultaneously creating rural queer communities and publics. How, as Scott Herring identifies, rural queer stylistics have the evocative power of an utterance which puts things in a new light. To this end, alongside their call for action, the Electric Dirt Collective featured 3 images of subverted Civil War narratives on their website that emphasize how a rural queer aesthetic and politics can subvert entrenched violent narratives about the rural. So, for example, one of these images shows a vulva bleeding on a white hood with the rallying cry, "Bleed on the KKK." In these kind of artistic examples, we see a kind of undermining of the self-seriousness and claims to a romanticized version of history, and a kind of like campy intervention and disruption. Advocating for an end to environmental degradation and white supremacy in Appalachia and the South, while supporting universal healthcare and workers' rights and opiate addiction harm reduction, the Electric Dirt Collective operates at what they call the intersections of coal mines and class, race and religion, food justice, and colonialism. They intentionally work to eliminate gatekeepers, those with access to higher education and resources that many folks do not have, and who determine who and what is documented and who or what is omitted from history. In order to support this self-representation, the Electric Dirt Collective invites submissions for both their Instagram account and zine. The Electric Dirt Collectives aim to queer Appalachia in the South and form rural queer communities built on nature, social justice, art, homespun cultural traditions, and anything made in a cast iron skillet, are hopeful and utopic. As Jose Esteban Munoz defines it, queer futurity is all about desire. Quote, desire for both larger semi-abstractions such as a better world or freedom, but also more immediately, better relations within the social that include better sex and more pleasure. I also see this hope operating within Phineas the Oriole in lines like, if I touch her there, everything about me will be true, the new world discovered without pick or axe, and my hand waits for permission for my life to agree to be changed forever. In the poem, the speaker's desire and pleasure have the capacity to bring about a new and different world. Hopeful futurity can be seen in the Electric Dirt Collective slogan that the future is old time. This slogan gestures toward Munoz's observation that utopia exists in the quotidian, in the simple, slow, earthy, and homemade. I interpret the Electric Dirt Collective's turn towards the homespun and old time as potent critiques of the present world's modes of consumption and temporality. A utopia, according to Munoz, understands its time as reaching beyond some nostalgic past that perhaps never was, or some future whose arrival is continuously belated. The catchphrase, the future is old time, gestures to a past that perhaps never was. Through their reclamation of queer utopic memory and hopeful futurity, the Electric Dirt Collective reimagines the social. Queer time steps out of the self-naturalizing linearity of straight time and moves towards the world otherwise. By positing that the future is old time, the Electric Dirt embraces what Munoz calls queerness is time. And as he defines this, queerness is ecstatic and horizontal temporality, is a path and movement to a greater openness to the world. Finney's 2020 poetry pairing, Orangery and the Clitoris, published by Gertrude Press, demonstrate the ecstatic temporality and greater openness to the world that Munoz articulates. Orangery, in its lush description, merges the body, pleasure, desire, and the natural world, entangling speaker, lover, plant life, and planet. And this is a quote, what sweeter world could be voyaged from the earth's center, pieced of figs, suckle, orange, the twice-licked skin of key limes, breath of peppermint, braided, burning. The Clitoris is a wet poem, thinking through the relationship between vastness, potential desire, water, and pleasure. Finney writes, in water, desire can rise, honor sea levels, ignore landlocked cartographers. In water, desire refuses retreat. Published on the same page, The Clitoris and Orangery as two poems make a powerful sensual pairing, calling into being a world where lush pleasure and desire flourish and flower. Queer Rural Futures offers a critique of the present, of representations of the South as conservative and heteronormative. By casting a picture of what can and perhaps will be, they look towards a future full of queer ways of knowing and relating in rural places. Readers are invited to participate in the persistent, arduous, and complex relationship queer rural writers and characters have with Appalachia when they encounter works like those created by Finney and the Electric Dirt Collective. Rural queer representation and self-representation work to undo the historic invisibilization of rural queer lives and stories. And here am I works cited, and thank you so much. I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Sage. And to keep on with the poetry, I believe Eileen, you're going to talk about some poetry as well. And then I'm going to mess it up at the end and bring in fiction.
Oh. All right, there we go. Yeah, hey everybody. I will have my camera off for part of this presentation because of my internet connection here, but I just wanted to pop on to say hello so you can see my face, the face behind the voice today. Yeah, so today I'm going to be discussing the poetics of Emily Blair. Emily Blair is the pen name of Emily Blair Breyer, who you all have been introduced to previously. So I'm going to pop off my camera here to begin. So today I'll be discussing the queer poetics of Emily Blair. Blair is a queer Appalachian writer and community college professor. Originally from Fort Chiswell, Virginia, she now lives in North Carolina with her cat and her spouse and her amazing dog, Henry, who I've come to love. Her poetry and nonfiction often focus on queer identity, the body, and body horror, and often reimagine the traditional love story narratives throughout the lenses of trauma and shifting understandings of the self. So my presentation today will explore the ways in which queer Appalachian poet Emily Blair writes the body as landscape and abstraction. Through the lens of queer theory, I argue that Blair constructs a radical self in opposition to heteronormative Appalachian society by rendering the self as landscape and other abstractions. Using Blair's chapbook, We Are Birds, I want to present the ways in which Blair reclaims an Appalachian landscape and identifies the queer body within nature. Using queer bodies to speak towards Appalachian geography and vice versa, Blair's poetry navigates and subverts expectations about queer sex, queer relationships, and the places in which queerness not only exists but abounds. So we're going to look a little bit at Judith Butler for this. Judith Butler argues that sexuality is not an essential truth derived from the body's materiality, but rather a regulatory fiction. Butler writes, sexuality is the repeated performance of the body, a set of repeated acts within a highly rigid regulatory frame that congeals over time to produce this appearance of substance, of a natural sort of being. If we're to understand sexuality as a performance of repeated behaviors per Judith Butler's theories, then Blair's poetry is enacting a new kind of performance from the materials around Appalachia. In Appalachia in particular, there's an insufficient language for queerness, for lesbian sex. So Emily Blair created it from landscape around her. She performed sexuality as the landscape itself. So today in particular, I'm looking at the series, This Is How Two Women Have Sex, which is from Emily Blair's chapbook, We Are Birds. And I'm going to put on my camera for this part because I'm going to read you all two poems that I'm going to discuss. So this is the chapbook that I'm looking from, We Are Birds, from Dancing Girl Press. And this first poem I'm reading to y'all is This Is How Two Women Have Sex, 18. She is gas stove. I am chrysanthemum, standing dead in a nearby vase. This is to say, she ignites, stays on indefinitely, and we are fundamentally disparate. I thought I might stay here with her, shedding light, but she remains indifferent and infinite. I once told her we would sustain each other as if fire could give me anything. I threw out red, orange, please love me, please look at me once adoringly. So in this poem, Blair poses her lover as the gas stove, and Blair is the chrysanthemum. We are seeing an object that has been transposed into the Appalachian landscape, into the domestic sphere, this gas stove, this image of rurality, right up against the chrysanthemum dead in the vase. We are seeing two objects opposed and in love, and this is the sexuality. The next poem we're going to look at together. This is How Two Women Have Sex, 19. Right in here. My lover, the magnolia, shakes under sprawled dawn light. She's anxious because the sun burns her buds into existence. My lover, reborn, wants nothing to do with me. In love instead with bees and wind and whatever else might fulfill her. So here we have Blair again abstracting her lover, this time not as the inanimate gas stove, but as the magnolia tree. Again, Blair is drawn to the materiality around her in the landscape to create language. If we create language as a means of understanding our reality surrounding us, if language is a construct in the same way that sexuality is, as Judith Butler proposes, then we're to understand that Emily Blair Breyer's poetics are a means of a radical self-construction from the materiality surrounding her. And I just love this phrase, my lover, the magnolia. That just gets me so much. Okay, popping back off the camera here to do the rest. So Emily Blair utilizes these abstract renderings of emotions and romantic relationships in her collection, We Are Birds. And in this way, she offers a new language of queerness and a model for queer sex. Blair's metaphors for queer sex and bodies, proposing her and her lovers as animals, plants, and architecture, is proliferate throughout We Are Birds. This shows her rootedness to the land and her dedication to demonstrating Appalachia as a place of queerness, as a place of queer future. As a takeaway from this presentation today, I want to offer y'all a creative writing practice. This is something that I do with my poetry students. I want for you all to consider what your own romantic relationships abstractions would be. The model that I offer you is this. Pronoun is blank. I am blank. Emily Blair Breyer's example is, she is gas stove. I am chrysanthemum. So I want y'all to take a little time considering, what would your abstraction be? Are you landscape or are you object? Okay. Thank y'all. I appreciate you listening in.
Thank you so much, Eileen. And now I've got these burning questions in my brain about what sort of objects people would be. So I'm going to share my screen really quick. Assume that this will work. I swear, this is like having a seance. It's like, can you all hear me? Do we see anything? You know, knock 3 times on the table if you can see the presentation. All right. Pretty good. So I'm moving away from poetry and kind of focusing on fiction more in this particular presentation. And as Jeff Mann and Julia Watts note in the introduction to LGBTQ fiction and poetry from Appalachia, both LGBTQ and heterosexual Appalachian writers have portrayed queer characters in their work for decades. However, the selected bibliography at the end of the collection also shows that, as the slide tells you, 68% of the 100 works included were written in the last 20 years, and over half of those were written in the last 10. And so while there recently has been more diversity in gender and sexual orientation within Appalachian literature, particularly within the last 2 decades, there is still a significant lack of queer representation inside many works. In addition to utilizing books and online interviews, I had the privilege of speaking with Anne Pancake, Silas House, Jason Howard, Ron Rash, and Pamela Duncan to figure out the reasons for such limited representation. And I just want to stop there because couple things. This was planned to be including much larger interviews and many more people. And I began the interviews in 2019. Jason and Silas actually came to WCU's, the word is escaping me, where we have authors come and they read things. And it's a wonderful event for everyone, that event. And so they came to the Lit Fest, there's the word. And then I met with Anne Pancake at the 2019 ASA conference. We were on a panel together. And then I work with, I'm very fortunate to work with Ron and Pam. And so I started out with this core idea of sort of interviews and was going to work out from there. And then 2020 happened. And so I have yet to collect more interviews because you can't really go out and see people and nobody has the emotional energy to talk to anyone. And so here we are. So I understand that, this is a fairly homogenous looking group. And I am looking to interview BIPOC writers, trans writers, writers under 30, and kind of build on this. So it's not lost on me that like, hey, you should probably have a more diverse cast of interviewees. I get that, and I'm working on that. And if any of you know anyone who would love to talk to me about that, please send them my way, because I really would like to expand on this and see if some of the findings are consistent across a greater representation of writers. So certainly not all of these folks identify as LGBTQ, but I wanted to talk to heterosexual writers in order to establish some of the reasons that straight writers may not include gay characters in their work, or queer characters in their work. And I also wanted to uncover some of the barriers to queer representation in Appalachian literature, as well as how to overcome them. Pamela Duncan admits that she grew up in a binary world, and that while she has queer cousins, uncles, and a brother, that their sexualities were not known at the time she was a child and adolescent. Despite identifying as straight, Duncan is adamant about the clear need for representation, stating, "Growing up, seeing myself in stories, everybody needs that." As examples, Duncan discusses the importance to her of stories that included intergenerational relationships between women, especially working class women, and stories written in the dialect that she heard her grandmother speak. And then Jason Howard, in an interview with Chris Green, holds Harriet Arno's The Dollmaker as a formative text for similar importance. He said, "I couldn't put it down because I recognized pieces of my own family's story and that of Gertie Neville's and her kin. I saw glimpses of Gertie and Clovis when I visited my aunts and uncles who had settled in Ohio, having moved there in the 1950s to find work." If such heteronormative representations of family life and growing up in Appalachia are essential to Appalachian youth, imagine the belonging queer Appalachians growing up in the region could find in representative literature. And actually, that's part of the reason I sent my niece Savannah Sippel's book. When discussing if Duncan, as a cisgender heterosexual woman, was concerned about accurately portraying a queer character, she echoed a sentiment that likely is shared by other straight cisgender Appalachian writers, and that was the fear of getting it wrong. There we go. So she talked about, you worry about the appropriation of culture, about getting it right. She did say that in creating such a character, talking to folks who are part of that culture and interviewing them would be helpful, as would reading nonfiction and fiction of the culture. Essentially she was talking about doing like a sensitivity reading, or like, hey, I probably shouldn't, as a cisgender straight person, create a queer character without knowing any queer Appalachian people, right? Sometimes the themes that writers focus on or that emerge through their work can also unintentionally contribute to a lack of queer visibility, as can their writing processes. So in talking to Ron Rash and Ann Pancake, both reported that they really don't think much about their character's sexuality. Rash reported, as he had in many prior interviews, that it's not so much that I create the characters, they kind of emerge. Characters come to me, I start with plot because of that. I don't really know their sexuality. And at the time he gave me an example of a character that he was working on, and he's like, well, she doesn't seem very feminine, and I don't really know her sexuality, and it just has to come out as I write the book. And then one of the things that he also added, though, is that his inattention to sexuality is also likely his quote unquote luxury of being heterosexual. I don't really have to think about it. While Pancake does identify as queer, she's also concerned about the environment and plainly states we're not going to be queer if we don't have an earth. And that was when I was specifically asking about some of the characters in Strange as This Weather Has Been. These different foci and processes serve to highlight that there are a variety of reasons for limited representation, but it's necessary to realize that not all limitations are the result of discrimination or oversight. In addition to the fear of getting it wrong and differing themes, when investigating the reasons that Appalachian writers might avoid creating queer characters in their work, several barriers to literary representation seem to repeat. One of the main concerns of writers is that they might not want their own sexuality analyzed, particularly if they're questioning or they're not open with others about their orientation. Duncan mentions that even the latent stuff that's in there can cause the audience to interrogate what they're reading and its writer's sexuality or motives. Because again, a lot of times people kind of assume that the narrator is the author. Duncan specifically mentions a scene from Silas House's Clay's Quilt, in which two of the main characters have a sleepover, which House admitted in a later interview with me that it was meant to hint at sexuality during a time that he was not open about that aspect of his identity. And so in a 2017 interview with Josh Inocencio, House states, even when I wasn't out, the way I looked at the world was shaped by being a gay man. An admission that sort of supports the subtle imagery that Duncan noticed when she read the text. House added in our conversation that in addition to the fear of authors outing themselves, including gay characters seems to invite a certain complexity and scrutiny that straight characters do not. Essentially, he says, you can't write an Appalachian book about a gay character just living his life. So there are consequences even in accurately portraying, such a character and, engaging in everyday events. Like he was just like, you can't write about, the queer guy going to Costco. Like it's not, it sort of invites additional layers of complexity. This complexity in creating queer characters is mirrored by the complexity for many of living as queer in Appalachia. In the introduction to LGBTQ fiction and poetry from Appalachia, editors Julia Watts and Jeff Mann point out that writers who define themselves as both queer and Appalachian often find that the juxtaposition of identity is difficult, confusing, and conflicted, adding that for those of us who determinedly and insistently claim both queer and regional identity, life is complicated. Living openly as an LGBTQ person in Appalachia, in America, including in Appalachia, can cause one to deal with targeted violence in its myriad forms, including hate speech and discrimination. Jason Howard blames this largely on the culture of misogyny in America and that, quote unquote, there's nothing worse than being a woman except to be like a woman. Such danger isn't hyperbolic. Conversion therapy is still legal in a lot of parts of Appalachia, and there are still folks in the region who were sent to behavioral health hospitals just for being gay. And there was actually an article on that not long ago about Bill Richards from Charleston, West Virginia. So facing discrimination, especially in healthcare, is also a serious barrier. Even nationally known writers are not immune from such discrimination, as Julia Watts, who co-edited the collection, this is about a year and a half ago, was recently disinvited from the Knox County Public Library's inaugural Literary Festival for Teens, despite writing ample works for teens and young adults, and in particular those readers who identify as LGBTQ+, rural, and of various ethnicities and socioeconomic backgrounds. The organizers for the event claim that they disinvited Watts because they did not want to promote her entire body of work, which they believe includes lesbian/erotica, despite that Watts would only be reading from her work meant for teens. Organizers did claim that they would make a similar decision for hetero writers of erotica, which Watts points out is quite a subjective term, and that they actively sought out authors representing diverse genres in teen literature, including LGBTQ authors. This being the inaugural event, there's really no history to determine the accuracy of their statement or if they would treat straight writers the same way. One has to wonder if sort of the library's choice is based on the same discrimination that around the same time led to the drag queen story hour protests throughout the country. Again, I started this research a couple of years ago, if y'all remember the drag queen story hour protests, and people were like, oh, you're going to brainwash our 3-year-olds and what have you. Which sought to limit children's exposure to the diversity of human expression, and particularly LGBTQ or genderqueer people. Those protesting such events often couch their beliefs in family values and religion. Families and communities not openly discussing sexuality because of such values or religion is another reason that the writers gave for the lack of queer representation in Appalachian literature. In addition to Duncan's queer male relatives, Ron Rash, for example, shared that his aunt is a lesbian and everyone has always seemed to know it, but her sexuality was never a topic of discussion. And I know that that's true even for some of my own relatives. And Rash adds that the region has long been conservative as a whole, and that while there seemed to exist, at least in his family, lots of acceptance, of LGBTQ family and community members, discussing such identities outright was and perhaps still is fairly taboo. Anne Pancake shared that while there were rumors and gossip of who might be queer when she was growing up, one's sexuality was typically discussed in hushed tones, as seen as something that didn't need to be openly talked about. Silas House also agreed that there's a certain silencing that exists in the region, and silencing was his word. People have often been taught to please and respect their elders, and thus some folks avoid coming out publicly to avoid upsetting their loved ones. Of course, religion in Appalachia can also play a role in how a family may respond to their queer loved ones, as well as how queer youth growing up feel about themselves. Hal stated that he grew up in a culture that believed one could simply pray the gay away, a theme that readers see in his novel, Southernmost. Julia Watts touches on the power of religion as well, stating, "This is a region where the predominant religion says that if you're a sinner, you shouldn't be the way you are." This rejection that can be felt by queer persons in the area can be countered in part by representation. The representation in Appalachian literature is one way to really make that happen. For some writers, though, there's certainly plenty of hope for acceptance in literary representation. Anne Pancake expresses optimism that as the danger to queer people lessens and acceptance bolsters, that hopefully more writers will be comfortable coming out, which would generally result in greater representation in Appalachian literature. She also hopes that queer representation in literature will help create more gay writers, which will continue to fuel growth in that canon. Silas House adds, with Jason Howard nodding in agreement, that most of us haven't felt safe, but that's going to change in 10 to 15 years. That said, danger can be part of the reason that queer Appalachians leave the region, kind of echoing towards some of the issues that Sage discussed in her paper, along with many of their heterosexual counterparts. The pressure in flight from Appalachia, particularly for queer individuals, may also keep writers from representing this demographic in their work, fearing that the work will not reach their intended audience of queer Appalachians, and particularly young people. There is some truth to the flight. Pancake noted that she left the region closeted, and did not come home until she was living elsewhere. She added that during the recent return to Pancake's home, West Virginia, her partner was a bit concerned about being openly gay in the region, largely due to unfair stereotypes. And she did say that, she said that she and her partner have been fine living in West Virginia, but she also said, I don't know if people don't realize that we're a couple, like maybe they think we're besties or sisters or something. And she thought that maybe other people's perceptions of their relationship could be part of the reason that they weren't really facing any kind of harassment or discrimination. In a piece for Oxford American, Misha Marin shares the sentiments of Pancake's partner. Marin writes that prior to meeting her husband, she'd only dated women. And when she and her husband decided to return to West Virginia, she might not be so eager to return if I was bringing a woman home. While the migration of queer Appalachians certainly is a reality for some folks, such movement is also quite complicated, as Hugh Ryan reveals in his essay, Queer in Rural America. Ryan explains that the necessity or perceived necessity of flight is fueled partially by the media, who talk only about rural queerness in the context of high-profile murders or low-life government officials, and push the idea that the route to happiness for gay folks leads inexorably away from the countryside, which makes me also think of Carter Sickles' most recent book. Many of the LGBTQ authors that I interviewed and researched countered this stereotype, though, through their deliberate insistence that Appalachia was home and they didn't desire to leave. In addition to not wanting to leave the region, there are also plenty of community members who are unable to leave, often due to employment, disability, socioeconomic status, family obligations, or other needs. The reality is that there are thriving queer individuals and communities in Appalachia who will benefit greatly from increased literary visibility. And I'm going to skip ahead so that we have plenty of time for questions, but I do cover the fact that, West Virginia has the largest per capita amount of trans kids in the country, and what a lot of that representation can do to help them. In addition to Howard, Silas House and Anne Pancake also made clear that having queer representation in their formative years would have been really helpful. Silas House said, I always was searching for that book, and the visibility in literature would have freed me to my truth a lot earlier. Anne Pancake offers similar sentiment, stating that I think had there been role models, I would have been open to that. And Jeff Mann, in a 2019 interview with Anna Patrick, shares the power of inclusion of queer characters in literature by saying, that's how I learned I was gay. I read a novel. It's important to note that students being open about their sexuality, and this, again, I'm cutting a little bit to save room for time, but Silas House had been talking about how being a queer writer and professor out on campus, that he was a really great role model for a lot of his students. He said, the biggest blessing in my teaching career is having students come to me and say, I'm out here on campus, I want to be who I am back home, but I don't know how. And he adds, we have a lot to share culturally. They might have lots of professors who are allies, but they don't talk the way that I talk. And so it is important to note that students being open about their sexuality not only benefits them, but also those with whom they interact. Samantha Allen, in Real Queer America, LGBT Stories from the Red States, quotes an important statistic in the epilogue to her book. Over the past decade, the percentage of Americans who support LGBT people and the percentage of Americans who report knowing an LGBT person have risen in tandem, according to a 2009 Gallup poll. She then goes on to acknowledge that only 30% of Americans now know a transgender person, but that by reading her book, they essentially know her. And so the benefits of bolstering the voices of queer writers and encouraging Appalachian writers to create more queer characters in their works are numerous. By committing to work on these goals, we might be able to quite literally, save lives and open minds. And there's a lot of good work going on currently in the region as well. So I know Travis Roundtree was on here, and he's part of the LGBTQ archive projects going on at Jackson County, North Carolina. And again, we are seeing, as the bibliography showed, there are more queer writers and characters than ever in Appalachian Lit. And we've seen some recent publications as well. I know Emily and I both mentioned that book, LGBTQ fiction and poetry from Appalachia. There's also the recent Storytelling in Queer Appalachia, Imagining and Writing the Unspeakable Other, which came out with, it was Ohio University Press. West Virginia University Press. And then Zane McNeil and I are actually working on a special issue of the Journal of Appalachian Studies right now on queer fabulation, which hopefully will be out this fall. And then there's a new series at the University of Kentucky Press, right? The Appalachian Futures one. So there's a lot going on to really increase queer representation and queer visibility in Appalachian Lit. And that's all I have. So does anyone have questions? Wonderful, thoughtful questions for any of us? I believe you can raise your little hand if you go to the little ellipsis at the top. There's a little hand raising thing. Or no, there's a happy face with a hand. And also go that route. If none of you have questions, I'll come up with some. I promise I'll start calling on people. It'll be like being in my class. I have a question for Emily. Emily, is it awkward to sit on a panel where somebody's talking about your work? I would think personally as a creative writer, it would be terrifying.
Well, Eileen is incredibly intelligent and good at things, so I trusted her completely. Also, all of that, the chat book was mostly written in like 2017, and so I'm like, remember that child who wrote a book once? That's adorable. So mostly fine, but yes, I always appreciate Eileen talking about my work, but she picked good poems. At least she didn't pick some of the poems where I was like, wow, why did you do that? So, it's a fun experience.
Well, that's reassuring. I always worry that I'm gonna do something where I'm gonna write about an author's work and they're just gonna sit there and glare at me and tell me I'm wrong. Anyone else have questions? Or perhaps you're all still pondering on Eileen's question about, what kind of object or landscape would you be?
Also, for those who don't want to turn their mic on, you can put your question in the chat.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, if no one has questions, it does not seem they do. So either they're all asleep or we did a really good job of stating our points. It's been wonderful to have you all here. Thank you so much for coming to our panel on queer Appalachian literature, and look forward to maybe seeing some of you or interacting with some of you throughout the rest of the conference. Have a wonderful afternoon.